Okay, edTPA Task 1 Planning. So this is the first section of edTPA. Most of what you do in this section of edTPA corresponds with your curriculum course. So this is curriculum and instruction for elementary education, curriculum and instruction for adolescence education. So the good news about the edTPA is that the Elmira College Lesson Plan has everything you need to design to do your edTPA. So basically what we did when we designed the Elmira College Lesson Plan is we looked at the edTPA and said, what are all the things that you need in the edTPA? And we backward designed the lesson plan so that if you wrote Elmira College lesson plans for everything in your learning segment, then you have everything you need in order to do the edTPA, okay? And I'm gonna break this down. So Elmira College lesson plan has the answer to all the questions. You guys know this, you've all submitted multiple Elmira College lesson plans. Hopefully you could recite parts of it in your sleep, you know it so well. But I'm gonna break it down here to show you how it connects, okay? So the Elmira College lesson plan, the first part is stage 1, right? And so you all have in stage 1, the first part that you fill out, right? So you fill out your essential topic or theme for the lesson. These essential questions and topics lead to your central focus, right? So remember on the edTPA, you are taking a learning objectives and essential questions that connect to a subunit, right? So usually our units are about 4 to 5 weeks long, and there are subunits within that. So you're thinking about a week of instruction. We say 3 to 5 lesson plans. I suggest 5 lesson plans. That's how I do it in my classes. But there's a theme that hangs together from those particular lessons. And those are listed here. So when you look at 5 lessons that hang together around common essential questions and common topics, that's your learning segment. Now, more importantly, the part that people struggle with the most is this whole idea of language function and process vocabulary, right? So you all know process vocabulary because that's what we taught you throughout your designing of lessons in your curriculum classes. And so for every lesson you created, you identified your process vocabulary. These are those verbs that talk about what students are doing: infer, compare, justify, explain, right? We call it at Elmira College process vocabulary. They call it on the edTPA language function, right? So when you're going through the edTPA and you keep seeing the phrase language function and your anxiety is rising and you start to sweat and you start to think, what is that? Who's ever heard of language function? Just remember, you need a translation dictionary. They mean process vocabulary. Any place that says language function, cross it out, write process vocabulary, and know that you have already listed the process vocabulary for every lesson because you wrote an Elmira College lesson plan, okay? When they talk about vocabulary, all right, they mean content vocabulary. So when they say, we want you to demonstrate that your students know and understand vocabulary, we call that content vocabulary. When they talk about vocabulary, they're talking about the nouns, right? So usually our list of content vocabulary are nouns. Words like revolution, denominator, another example of a content vocabulary, coup d'etat, right? Like different kinds of concepts that you're teaching them. And then the last thing is that you all wrote learning objectives or outcomes for each lesson, right? And we told you to use your process vocabulary to help state the learning objectives. So Your learning objective is your language demand. What are my students going to do to demonstrate the language function? So a language function is the process vocabulary, right? I want my students to be able to compare and contrast the Iranian Revolution with the French Revolution, right? I want them to compare and contrast those things. The process vocabulary, or the language function, what they're doing with language, is comparing. The language demand is how they're going to do it, right? So my students are going to compare and contrast the Iranian Revolution and the French Revolution through a Venn diagram, right? So my students are going to create a Venn diagram to compare and contrast the French Revolution and the Iranian Revolution, right? So the language demand is what you're asking them to do. You're asking them to create a Venn diagram. The language function is the process vocabulary. So why do you create a Venn diagram? What's the function? If you want to think about why is it called language function, what's the function of a Venn diagram? Well, the function of it is to compare, right? So that's the process we're trying to do. We're trying to compare. So don't freak out about these words: language function, vocabulary, language demand. It is just their convoluted way of saying things we've been talking about the whole time we've been in teacher education. Okay, so the next part of your, and feel free to break in if you have a question, right? I can't see everybody's screen because of the way my thing is displayed. So if you have a question, feel free to break in. So the second part that you filled out when you did your lesson plan was that you filled out stage 2 assessment, right? And if you were in my class, you definitely had at least 3 different formative assessments for each lesson, right? Can somebody give me an example of a formative assessment, something that they would have done in that particular place? Rachel, can you give me an example of a formative assessment you did in a particular lesson, or one of your favorite formative assessments?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think thumbs are usually pretty good, especially like if you just want a quick one. And whenever I did it on the edTPA, I would always explain it like, if my students give me a thumbs up, I know that they fully understand the content and I don't have to keep going. If they give me a thumbs in the middle, I know that some students may need a refresher, and maybe I'll restate what I was saying, and then thumbs down means I need to totally rework what I was just saying.
Okay, so a simple formative assessment is thumbs up, thumbs down. You might have some video demonstration of this as well, right? So people doing thumbs up, thumbs down, but you might not, right? It might just be something that you talk about as one of your formative assessments. What are some other formative assessments? What's another example of a formative assessment? Maybe something that you would have physical proof of.
An exit ticket.
Okay, so an exit ticket is also a formative assessment that you may have done with your students, right? And so when I talk about having 3 different ones, right? Thumbs up, thumbs down, and an exit ticket, those could be 2, right? So while Rachel's delivering the content, she's not going to want to go through the whole process of everybody writing. She's just doing touch base, like, can I keep going, right? So this thumbs up, thumbs down is a good formative assessment. The exit ticket is also a good formative assessment. It comes at the end of the learning. It lets people know. What's a kind of formative assessment that you might do at the beginning of the learning, say in your hook section?
You could do like a KWL chart.
Absolutely. So a KWL chart, the nice thing about a KWL, and I think you know, I probably see that on about 30% of my lesson plans that are turned in. If you do a KWL chart at the beginning of the lesson, you know, what do I already know? What do I want to know? Then you have the information that helps you understand what you should be teaching. So those three are formative assessments that are helpful in designing your lessons. Helps you know where students are, helps you know if they're getting what you're doing, and at the end of the learning, you're testing to see if they've learned that information, and you have physical proof. You also, with the KWL chart, have physical proof. So the nice thing about this is when you're talking about a learning segment, if you're doing 5 different lesson plans, right? If you did 2 to 3 formative assessments in these 5 lesson plans, then you have between 10 and 15 formative assessments that you could use to write about on the edTPA, right? So some days you might not have what you think are the best formative assessments. Other days you did a really good job with them. So you have those. You also have like a lot of times in math, when students come in, they do a problem, a bell ringer right in the beginning. That also could be a formative assessment. How much did they understand the learning from the night before? You have those, you keep those copies of those bell ringers. Then you also have the summative assessment that goes along with this learning segment. During class, we didn't usually always include the summative assessment in this section. We usually just included it the day we did it. When you're writing the edTPA, I would recommend just repeating what you're doing. So, for example, if you're having students write essays about a character, right, or particular characters in a novel, and that's your summative assessment at the end, you might want to put that little short description there. What you need to know is that this test, quiz, essay, presentation, these things are going to be used as your example of discourse or syntax. So a lot of times that's the place where Elmira College students get really freaked out. What is this about discourse, syntax? I don't know how I've done that. You have done that. Trust me. It is part of your summative assessment. It's what you've done. They just like to create fancy language for simple things that we've all done. So don't stress about it. I'm going to show you an example in just a minute. But this is where you find those things on the Elmira College Lesson Plan. Then you have stage 3. And when you go through stage 3, if everybody can mute their, I'm just getting some feedback. So if everybody can mute their, thank you. Great. So in stage 3, you're listing out all of the different sections of your delivery of content in your learning class, learning tasks. So in that first section, the introduction and focus activity, a lot of times that's where your prior learning is assessed. So when they're asking about that, go back and look at your focus activities. Your delivery of content is a place where you're differentiating, and you've talked about that. So you want to think about, how did I differentiate in my learning of delivery of content? In your guided practice, this is when students are actually doing things. You often see examples of discourse and syntax here. In your independent practice, you also see examples of differentiation, you see examples of discourse, and you see examples of syntax. So sometimes in the independent practice or the guided practice, you have a video of you having discussions with students about what you're learning. Maybe you have a video of students talking about the characters. In those discussions are where you're going to have the discourse around English, social studies, mathematics, because that's where they're speaking in the language of the discipline. And then certainly one of the most important part is in planning. How do we plan for varied student learning needs? That's already in your lesson plan. You've already talked about these target students and how you are differentiating for their learning. And that's a big piece of the edTPA. Okay, so what I want to talk about right now are the rubrics. And the reason that I want to go over the rubrics is because I think this is something that students often ignore. They look at the questions, what do I have to answer? And they don't spend time on the rubrics. And the reason I want to spend time on the rubrics is because you could write something beautiful about your teaching, and it would be a very well written, accurate analysis of being a good teacher. But if it's not what they're grading you on, it doesn't matter how good of a teacher you are if that's not how they're measuring the teaching. I mean, they might read your edTPA and say, wow, this person's a beautiful teacher, but she didn't talk about anything that I have to score her on. So I can't just say, well, you didn't do the task, right? So that's super important. I'm going to spend some time talking about the rubrics. Now, what's important to understand about the rubrics, you don't just want to read level 5. You have to read level 5, but you need to start out actually reading level 1. And the reason that you read level 1 is because level 1 is actually more explicit about how to do it wrong, right? So if you know how to do it wrong, or you know the little catch thing that you will definitely get a bad score if you do this. Like even if you do all kinds of other great things, if you do something in the level 1, then you will get a level 1 score, right? So I put the social studies rubrics here. All the rubrics are in the handbooks and they're on the website, but I wanted to talk about social studies. It's very similar to English and pretty similar to math as well, also similar to the elementary, right? So the first rubric they're going to grade you on is how do the candidates' plans build students' understanding of facts, concepts, and inquiry, interpretation, or analysis skills to build and support arguments or conclusions about historical events or a social studies phenomena. Okay, so that's unnecessarily wordy. What do they mean? Well, a bad edTPA is one that focuses solely on facts or a singular interpretation of historical events. All right, so what do I not want to do? I don't want to just do regurgitation of facts. If it's just a memorization, and this doesn't mean there isn't some memorization within your unit. Remember, this is the whole 5 lesson plans. It's the whole learning segment. So if the only thing you ever do is regurgitate facts, then you're going to score a level 1, right? So you need to make sure that you have connections to greater concepts, like concepts of why, for example, you could study the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, you could just memorize a bunch of facts, right? Who's Robespierre? What was the bread riot? I mean, I could memorize a bunch of facts, but that's not the important thing about the French Revolution. The important thing about the French Revolution is the Enlightenment idea that people should have a say in their government, right? So you want the bigger idea, the analysis. What was it that happened in France that meant that people were willing to, you know, revolt and risk getting beheaded? What happened? What went wrong, right? So what are the conditions that lead to a group of people overthrowing their government? That's the bigger argument, right? So you're going to build an argument about why the French are willing to revolt. Other things that give you a level 1, if there's content inaccuracies, right? So, you know, if you lead people down a particular road and you don't offer any other significant content that is accurate, right? So you say things that aren't true, that's a bad idea. And alignment. So that's something we spent a lot of time in class on, is this alignment. Like, what are your learning objectives? How are you assessing it? What are you doing in your class? So each of those things have to happen, right? And they have to be about the same thing. Okay, so level 2 is usually not as informative. I like to read level 1 to help me understand about what not to do, because usually that what not to do is clearer. And then I think about, okay, I need to do 3, 4, and 5. I always read 3, 4, and 5 because sometimes there's some base level things in level 3 that you have to do that maybe they don't mention in level 5. Like if you just read level 5, you're not going to see that. Level 3 is kind of the standard Level 3 means proficient. So that's the standard, right? So candidates' plans for instructions build on each other to support student learning of facts with clear connections to concepts, inquiry, interpretations, or analysis. Okay, so at a base level, when I create a unit about the French Revolution, I should start out with, you know, basic information and then build up to the big ideas, right? So am I doing this? Do I feed students little bits that help them to understand the French Revolution, and then I build on those ideas and help them get to analysis, help them get to the place where they can make arguments about why the French overthrew their government. So in level 4, I see the same thing. Candidates plan on instruction, build on each other to support student learning. And not only do I build arguments, I also support arguments, right? So level 4 means that I ask students to provide evidence, right? So you can think about a good example in history would be that they looked maybe at primary documents and they said, here's some support for what happened. Level 4 plus is what level 5 is. So you're doing all of these things. And the candidate explains how she will lead students to build explicit connections between inquiry, interpretation, or analysis, and supporting argument conclusions, as well as the central focus of the learning segment. So it's going back to that central focus and talking about what is it that I want students to know and be able to do. So I think this piece right here is something that you should feel pretty strong about, because this is what we spend a lot of time on. What do I want my students to know? What are those big ideas? Remember, as we rewrote essential questions, we were always saying, you know, don't make your essential question a one answer question, right? The reason is because that's just simple facts. We wanted the essential questions to be those bigger ideas, those levels of analysis and inquiry. And so you have that in your lesson plans. Okay, rubric 2. So rubric 2 is planning to support varied learning needs. And so this is, have you planned for your students? Have you expected there to be different kinds of students in your room? And I think anybody at Elmira College would have done this, because we spend a lot of time talking about it. Notice here, level 1, right? So if you have no planned supports, if you have no differentiated curriculum, if you don't mention the IEPs or 5044 plans of any of your students, then you're going to score a level 1. You need to talk about these supports, okay? Level 2, the plan supports are only loosely tied to the learning objectives or the central focus, right? So I've provided support, but it doesn't really help with them getting the main idea of the lesson. The plan supports, level 3, plan supports are tied to the learning objectives and the central focus with attention to the characteristics of the class as a whole. So what have I done for particular students to address their learning needs that also thinks about the whole class, right? Level 4 is the plan supports are tied to learning objectives and the central focus. Supports address the needs of specific individuals or groups with similar needs. Okay, so this is thinking about the idea of universal design for learning, right? So have you created some universal design aspects where you can say, okay, I've decided to do stations for this particular lesson. That's one of my universal design aspects. I'm thinking very specifically about student 1 who has ADHD and student 2 who has emotional disturbance and needs to be grouped with particular people to keep them from having an explosion during class, right? So those are 2 particular needs. But it also is just thinking about the needs of adolescents in general, that they need movement, they need activity, right? So they're thinking about the whole group. My whole group is age 13. 13-year-olds need to move around a lot. but I'm also thinking specifically about a student with ADHD, and I'm thinking about a student with emotional disturbance who I can put with 3 very calm students, and that will help them as they go through the stations. Supports level 5, the supports include specific strategies to identify and respond to key misconceptions, right? So my idea of stations, I might want to talk about in the stations, maybe in station 3. I know one of the big misconceptions is that Africa is a country and not a continent, right? So in the station about Africa, I go in and I talk specifically to students about, hey, I want you to think about how people talk about Africa. Do they talk about it as a continent, or do they talk about it as a country, right? So it's a support where you don't just have the students interpret the information, you actually have a planned strategy as a teacher to go in and address that particular misconception, right? So that's a support you offer beyond the particular learning plan. So those are just some examples of how you support varied student learning needs. You'll notice that our idea of having you talk about universal design, as well as talking about particular accommodations, takes you to the level 3 and 4, right? If you're just doing level 2, you're just saying, okay, I'm doing this one particular thing for John. But level 3, 4, and 5 is saying, well, 3 and 4 particular, what's the whole group? What am I doing for the whole group? And how am I targeting particular students within that whole group, but I'm thinking about the whole group's needs. And level 5 is really targeting on those key misconceptions. Now, rubric 2 connects very closely with rubric 3, using knowledge of students to inform teaching and learning. So this is thinking about what your students already know before they come into a class, right? So this connects to your context of learning that you wrote. And this is why Jesse's example of having done a KWL chart in your learning segment is really helpful. I've talked to other students also about maybe doing a pre-test. Pre-test can be stressful for some students, so the KWL chart is kind of nice. Sometimes students in the beginning in a hook statement, they might say, tell me everything you know about revolutions, right? And they just write a free write right in the beginning. So a free write might be an assessment that you would then use to talk about these things, right? So one thing when what your knowledge of students is varied, right? So your knowledge of students is, first of all, what do you know about them individually, but also what do you know about them in terms of this particular topic. So one thing to know right away is that level 1 says that if you represent your students with a deficit view, then you will get a level 1 for rubric 3. Now, this is the most common mistake that I see, and Rachel Berg has actually added a really good example of avoiding deficit language on our edTPA Canvas page. So you want to take a look at that, because on rubric 3 you will get a 1, right? So saying that your kids are lazy, saying that they don't know anything, you know, using language that is disparaging will get you a level 1. So level 3, what am I trying to do? Candidate justifies why the learning task or their adaptations are appropriate using examples of students' prior academic learning or personal, cultural, or community assets. Notice that you jump up to level 4 if you talk about their prior academic learning and their personal, cultural, or community assets. This is why I recommend doing the kind of pre-test or pre-quiz, or if you didn't do that, if you talk about what you know from them based upon their prior scores. So say you're teaching a 3rd grade literacy unit and you didn't do a pre-test, but you do say, okay, I looked at their literacy scores from 2nd grade and I had, you know, 20% of students reading at a first grade level and 25% reading at a second grade level, right? And so you can talk about that prior academic learning through that as well, right? So say you differentiated your instruction so that certain students get the directions read to them, right? The reason that you did that in your learning plan, the reason you read the directions out loud is because you know from their prior to academic learning, from the literacy scores they got, that you have students in the class that could not read the directions and understand them well. So your plan, you're planning to read that, is connected to their prior academic learning. And then you want to talk about personal, cultural, or community assets as well. So how do you connect that to who they are as students? Maybe you're teaching in a rural community, and so you want to talk about this in relation to the rural community that you live in. So for example, I observed a lesson in a community where a lot of people were owners of cattle, right? And so the teacher, the student teacher, connected the lesson to family members who owned cattle. And she talked specifically about what students had learned from being around cattle, from being around the meat industry, those kinds of things. So lots of students could talk about that. So that's a community asset, right? So they were in a beef producing region, and she made that particular connection. And then the level 4+ is the candidate's justification is supported by principles from research or theory. So this is in your description. You need to be talking about the research that supports why you did what you did. Okay. All right, so does anybody have any questions? Everybody's doing okay? All right. So the last thing, there's 2 more rubrics I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about rubric 4, and I'm going to talk about rubric 5. So rubric 4 is one place that I feel students get pretty stressed out. And that's because it starts talking about this language demand, right? So how does the candidate identify and support language demands associated with a key history, social studies, or learning task? And I'm going to go through some things to help you understand this. But so the language demands identified by the candidate are not consistent with the selected language function or task, right? So I gave the example before of a language function, that's a process vocabulary, to be compare and contrast, right? And the language demand is that I wanted them to create a Venn diagram. When I create a Venn diagram, I'm comparing and contrasting, right? But if my language function is compare, and what my demand is list. I want you to list all of the things related to the French Revolution. That doesn't help students compare and contrast. So if you have a language function, something like compare, and then the thing you ask kids to do doesn't help them compare, then you're going to get a level 1. So your language function, the thing they're trying to achieve, analysis, comparison, right, has to be directly connected to the task that you're going to do. Additionally, if your language supports, so the way you're supporting students are missing or not aligned, then you'll also get a level 1. If you only do one language demand, then you'll get a level 2. Okay. If you do 2 or more language demands, then you can get a level 3. So what I want you to know is that all Elmira College students should be able to get a level 4. And the reason is our lesson plan already includes vocabulary and symbols. That's the content vocabulary. You've already done that. Language function, that's the process vocabulary. Compare, infer, right? So those are the things that you've already done. And then 1 or more additional language demand, discourse or syntax. I'm going to show you examples of those. But basically, discourse or syntax is just the way the information is spoken about in that particular discipline, right? So syntax is within a sentence, right? So it's just one section, and discourse is a longer elocution of what's happening. And I know that sounds confusing. Just hold on, and I'm going to show you an example which will make it very easy. Level 4 plus language supports are designed to meet the students with different levels of language and learning. Like, I hope you did this, but you definitely did 4, right? If you filled out an Elmira College lesson plan, you definitely did level 4. Now, even if you didn't write out the whole Elmira College lesson plan, hopefully we made it such a part of the way you think about planning that you did all those things. You might have to go back and actually do the physical work of typing all those things in, but those things should already be there. Okay, so I'm just going to show you this because this, I think, helps with thinking about language function, right? So these are examples of edTPA language functions by subject, right? So this is the process vocabulary. In your process vocabulary, in elementary literacy, you were probably, if you're teaching 3rd grade, summarize and retell. Those are things that you probably did if you're teaching a literacy lesson in elementary literacy. So you want to think about, well, how did I have them summarize? How did I have them retell? Right? So then you're going to connect that to your learning objective. Your learning objective will list this process vocabulary with the language demand, or they call process vocabulary language function. Social studies, you analyze, compare, contrast, construct, describe. English, you analyze, argue, describe, explain, evaluate. So these are the terms that are used. For art, you analyze, compare, contrast, critique, question. Okay, so what does this look like? I love this breakdown here because it's color-coded. Color-coded is fantastic, right? So here's a sample learning objective that someone might have in their lesson plan. Students define artifact and list 3 characteristics of an artifact. Okay, so what you see right here is define is my language function. Okay, the red, that's my language function. We call it process vocabulary, edTPA calls it language function. Okay, students define artifact and list 3 characteristics of an artifact. So list is my language demand. What are you demanding students to do, right? What's the function of this language? That's my language function, or the process. What's the process they're going through? They're defining an artifact. Well, what are they actually doing? That's my language demand. I demand you to do this. I want you to list 3 characteristics of an artifact. My content vocabulary, artifact, and characteristics. Those are the nouns. Students have to know what a characteristic is in order to do this. They have to know what an artifact is to do this, right? So that's what the learning involves. So you all have learning objectives, right? So you all have already your process vocabulary. You have your language demand. You have your content vocabulary. Even if you didn't formally write out your entire lesson plan, which makes me cry a little bit if you didn't do that. But I understand that sometimes life gets ahead of you and you don't write out all the details. But even if you didn't write out all the details, you certainly had in your mind a learning objective. What are my students going to do? Do I expect them to learn? How do I know they learned it? That's in the learning objective. I know you did that in your lesson. So you just need to sit down and think about it in these terms. What was I asking them to do? What did they learn from this lesson? What did they get out of it? Okay, so I think this is really helpful because all this new vocabulary can be overwhelming. And it's like, what are they talking about? Okay, so here's just some examples of a language function and then a demand that goes with it. So if I want students to define, I want them to understand how to define these words. How do I know that they do it? I demand that they write definitions to vocabulary words, right? So the demand is write definitions. Assess, write a 1 paragraph of self-reflection. That's how I know. Compare, draw a Venn diagram and fill sections in. Debate, participate in a class debate. Construct, draw a comic strip with characters explaining the concept. Apply, solve word problems with involving one variable. Describe, speak aloud for 30 seconds describing the characteristics. Okay, so worst case scenario, you did not formally write out your lesson plans and you made Dr. Johnson cry, but it's okay. She's over it now. How do you just save yourself? Well, what you do is you work backwards, right? So you go back to your videos and you say, okay, what did I ask them to do? Well, I had all the kids drawing a comic strip. Well, what were they learning from the comic strip, right? So maybe I didn't write down what my language function is. Start from what you have in the video, right? That you saw what students did, and then work backwards to the function, and then work backwards to the learning objective, right? It's not the ideal situation, but we're not always in the ideal situation. So think about this chart. Start with your demand. What did you ask students to do? What did you demand them to do in a nice way? And then from that, what are they really doing? What's the big picture concept, right? So I asked my students to draw a Venn diagram. Okay, well, that's fun. I like circles, but why? Well, I asked them to draw a Venn diagram because I really wanted them to compare. Right? So I watched a good lesson in Kendra's class where she had students make live Venn diagrams. So the kids made a Venn diagram with their bodies, right? So they moved to one side if they liked all one thing, and they moved to the middle if they liked both. So they could physically see this Venn diagram. So she could have that, right? Construct a physical Venn diagram. Well, that's her demand. I demanded students to construct this physical Venn diagram. What's my function? My function is compare or contrast, compare and contrast, right? That's her language function. She has a video of those kids in that physical Venn diagram to show that they're comparing, right? She can use that as evidence of her assessment. So this kind of breaks it down into, okay, here's my learning objective. All right, what's my language function? What's my vocabulary? And what's my discourse, right? So this helps you just say, okay, what do real teachers do? Don't tell me all this vocabulary about language demands and discourse. Okay, in secondary social studies, pretty clear. Students will compare and contrast monarchies, democracies, and dictatorships. Okay, so what's my language function? That's compare and contrast. That's that process I hope students understand. All good historians know how to compare and contrast. That's why it's a function of historians. All right, so how do I know that they did that? Right, they provided a model how to use the Venn diagram to compare and contrast. Vocabulary, did I teach them vocabulary? Yes, I taught them monarch, dictator, and democracy. They didn't know those words before. I presented examples of terms. So maybe you have a PowerPoint slides where you have those terms on it. I had a question earlier about the PowerPoint slides, like how do you include those in the lessons and not make it too many pages? You can do a print screen where you put multiple slides on one page and save it as a PDF. So that's one little tip. Then in this compare and contrast monarchies, the last thing, if I want to score that high level 4 or 5, I also have to talk about discourse. So how did they take these things and then show me that they could be a historian? Well, I had them write a persuasive essay. First, I showed them a sample essay. I showed them an essay that someone wrote. Writing a persuasive essay about why they thought monarchies were the best idea, right? And then students wrote their own in-class essays or take-home essay where they tried to persuade other people which one they thought was best, right? So that's my example of discourse. I give an example here of secondary English. Students will use textual references to justify their interpretation of a character's traits. So justify is the function, right? So I've decided Lord of the Flies. I've decided that Piggy is the moral speaker for Lord of the Flies. Like, so I'm going to provide textual evidence to show statements that Piggy says throughout Lord of the Flies that justify why I believe he's the moral voice of Lord of the Flies. Character traits, vocabulary. We're going to review vocabulary and word chart and discuss meanings. And then justification statement is syntax. So this is where you have students talk. Maybe they spend the class looking at different characters in the book and finding examples about who they are, and then, you know, the function of the character in the book, and then you have a video of them talking about those particular characters. This is just for secondary and social studies and secondary English, but on the Canvas page, there is a section about, it says language demands, syntax, and discourse, understanding those things. And I have, the document there has these examples for every different edTPA handbook. So there's one for elementary, there's one for visual arts, there's one for math and science as well. Okay. All right, and then last slide. I know I'm 7 minutes over, so last slide is the planning assessments to monitor and support student learning. Okay, so this is the assessments that you use. The biggest piece of this will be your summative assessment, but you had formative assessments that led up to that summative assessment. If you use the Elmira College Lesson Plan, you had formative assessments. In order to get the highest score, not just in this section, but in the next section, which we'll talk about next week, you need to talk about at least 3 assessments. One of those is your summative assessment, and the next, in the task 3, you are going to do a deep analysis of that assessment, but you also want to talk about your formative assessment. So first thing, level 1 is if your assessments are always at that base level. For those of you guys who use Marzano, remember he talked about that base level of learning. If you're only doing recall, you only get a level 1 score. So there needs to be a level of analysis, okay, something a little bit higher level learning. So Bloom's taxonomy, you all develop that into your assessments. So you want to think about, you know, level 2 or higher in Bloom's taxonomy. Let's look at level 3 because that's our target starting point. We want to go beyond that, but the assessment provide evidence to monitor students' progress toward developing history and social studies understandings and use of facts, concepts, and inquiry, interpretation, or analysis during the learning segment. So are they analyzing what they're learning? And are they learning facts and concepts? Level 4, you need multiple forms of evidence, right? So you can't do one form of evidence. You can't just use your summative assessment. You have to talk about your formative assessments. Maybe you had a KWL chart. Maybe you did a Venn diagram and you have evidence of that. Maybe you have an exit ticket where they talk about something. Maybe you have a parking lot where students are analyzing different things. Level 4, you have to assess facts, concepts, inquiry, and analysis, but you also have to have them building and supporting arguments or conclusions. The best way to bring that in is either through an essay task or an explain their learning task, or through class conversation, right? So you might have like the mini lecture that I was just talking about in English, where students are presenting their ideas about a particular character and why that character is that way, right? So you can use short clips of students having that particular kinds of conversations. And then the last level 5 is just, you know, is it differentiated, right? So is there a way to differentiate that? Okay, so certainly when you go through the different parts of the edTPA in planning 1, it's easy to just look at the questions, but I want you to think specifically about, you know, what information do I have? The very first step before, I mean, after you watch this or listen to this and read all the rubrics, your next step, if you're feeling overwhelmed by the edTPA, your very next step is to go back and spruce up your lesson plans, right? So whatever stage that is, maybe you have beautiful, perfect lesson plans, and what you're gonna do is just go through and read them and highlight the different things we talked about, right? Or make those connections. What's my language function? What's my language demand? Where am I having students demonstrate discourse or syntax, right? Or you may have done kind of a skeleton version of your lesson plan and you didn't put as much detail as you need to put. Now that I've gone through the rubrics, you're going to go back and flesh out all those different pieces, being mindful of the things that the edTPA. Worst case scenario, you didn't write your lesson plans at all, and that happens sometimes. And if that's the case, then you just need to go back and reconstruct. So what I would do is watch your videos, watch what happens, look at all your materials, and pretend that you are writing it up for a substitute to do that lesson, to recreate the lessons you taught. So being mindful of all the things I talk about, but then writing those 5 lesson plans, because I'm not wasting your time by doing this. You also have to upload those lesson plans into the edTPA. So you are moving forward with creating your edTPA because you need those lesson plans. So that's really your first step after reviewing the requirements. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now so that I can take questions.